Hi, Kristina.
Hi,
Thank you so much for being here.
thank you so much for having me. I'm excited.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit just about you. Like, where are you from? Where do you live now?
Yeah, so I'm actually from the beach cities of Los Angeles. So yeah, it's great here. I love it. But all of my services are virtual, so I work with people from all over the world, pretty much.
Oh, that's awesome. Okay, cool. So that's a good segue. Let's talk a little bit more about what you do. So you're a type 2 diabetes specialist?
Yeah, so I'm actually a registered dietitian and I specialize in type 2 diabetes. I also work with people that have pre-diabetes, and it's really wonderful. You see all sorts of, backgrounds and experiences with it, all sorts of people, and I really enjoy it.
So what made you get into diabetes in general?
Okay, yeah. So I'll give you kind of the short story, but long story short, so I grew up in a German household, living with my grandparents and my mom. And my grandmother was always making amazing German food every day. Like by 9 in the morning, she already had dinner on the stove. But I saw her struggle because she had diabetes, and it was something that she just really, it was hard for her to enjoy the food that was amazing that she was making every day because of it. And as I went to school to get my degree in nutrition, I realized, as I furthered my education, that, diabetes management doesn't have to be that complicated and people don't have to have so much fear around it, which is, again, something that I just really saw her struggle with. And so she passed away in 2013. And, I just decided that, this is something that I want to work with. When I was working in the hospital setting, I actually kind of ended up being the diabetes dietitian for outpatient education. And so it's just kind of funny how things happen. I think I was meant to be here, and I enjoy working with this population.
I love that you put your like real life experiences to work. It's you always find more passionate people when you do that, when you find like there's a history behind it.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I've told you, but I loved following you because there's
Yeah.
this thing. So I'm a type 1 diabetic, and there's this thing amongst type 1s that we hate when people just say diabetes because we're like, whoa,
Yeah.
whoa, there's so many different types of diabetes, and everything requires a different management style and everything like that. And so I appreciated you because you always say type 2, and that means a lot to people with type 1. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you for sharing that. Honestly, that's really good to know. And again, just also, you're right. I think with type 1 diabetes, there's so many amazing type 1 diabetes dietitians out there, and most of them have type 1 diabetes themselves. And so I also find that, for them, they have this like personal lived experience that they can draw upon to help people with. And I just think that's so much more effective than for someone that doesn't have it, honestly.
Yeah. And so I'm curious, kind of from your end too, since you don't live with the disease, like what is your definition of like type 1 versus type 2, and even throwing in maybe gestational in there? Like, what is the difference?
Yeah, definitely. So there is a difference. I mean, at the end of the day, the common denominator is that there's not enough insulin, basically. So with type 1 diabetes, it's an autoimmune disease where your body attacks the cells that produce insulin. And so there's not enough insulin there. There's a deficiency of insulin. And so you have to take exogenous or outside of the body insulin in order to bring your blood sugar levels within range. But with type 2 diabetes, it's not an autoimmune disease. It's something that is kind of nature versus nurture. So there's not necessarily like one gene that causes it, but it can be genetic, it can be lifestyle, nutrition, exercise, ethnicity, all sorts of things come down to it. And so it really is a deficiency, but also your body not realizing that insulin is present. So your body can't use insulin effectively, and the pancreas just isn't doing its job. And then there's also gestational diabetes, of course, which is when during pregnancy, the body also, for everyone actually, goes under a little bit of insulin resistance during that time period. And so again, there's nature versus nurture kind of factors that come into it, but the hormonal changes basically create an environment where it's more difficult for your body to utilize insulin effectively. So blood sugar levels can get a little bit wonky.
Yeah, and it's such in general, diabetes is such an unfortunate disease, but then it gets complicated because there's so many different types, and it does
Yep.
require different management. And so because you're type 2 focused, and I love that you said it's not all about lifestyle, because that is definitely a misconception that comes with type 2 is like, oh, they've just been eating sugar their whole life and now they have type 2, and it bothers me when I hear that. So can you talk a little bit more about the other ways that someone could get type 2?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so many things that go into it: race, gender, age, family history. A lot of people that I work with just have a really strong family history. And, at the end of the day, we can't say exactly what caused type 2 diabetes to develop in that person. There are things like nutrition and exercise and stress and sleep that also go into it. But, some things we can control and some things we can't control. And I would even go as far to say that sometimes we can't control those controllable factors, right? Like even like say you're a single mom with 4 kids and you're in a food desert. That's pretty stressful. And I'm not sure that you can quite change that, right? So I think that we have to approach it with a lot of empathy, a lot of nuance in the discussion and looking at it. And I hate that there is kind of that stigma that people feel like, oh, this is something that somebody did to themselves. And honestly, I've worked with people that have type 2 diabetes across all age groups, from pediatrics to elderly, to, athletes to not. So it really, I say it doesn't discriminate, honestly, it really doesn't.
Yeah. So do you have to have the gene to get type 2?
No, you don't actually. So they are doing a lot of research into the genetic component of type 2 diabetes development, and they identified at least 150 different types of genes, but some people don't have those genes that develop it. So it really is kind of nature versus nurture, and we can't say necessarily at the end of the day, but there is definitely a genetic component.
Oh my gosh. Okay. That like breaks my heart because I'm like, you just hear
Yeah.
more and more people. I mean, in every type of getting diagnosed, it's so many people are getting diagnosed with diabetes in general. It is so sad. And I've
Yeah.
even heard people, I don't know if this is true, but I've heard stories of people that like went in to get like a medical surgery and then they
Yeah.
came out and then all of a sudden had type 2. And I'm like, what? Like crazy things like that too.
Yeah, that's why screening is so important too. I'm such a stickler for getting your yearly physical. I always post it on my Instagram. Hey, I'm here getting my yearly physical, get yours. So like come January, just get your physical, get screened for everything, get all your labs drawn, your lipid profile, your A1C, your glucose, everything. But yeah, sometimes people go in for that big surgery and they have to get tested for their A1C because high blood sugars can impact wound healing. So that's important as well. So yeah, people find out in all sorts of ways when they don't expect it.
So type 2 gets a pretty bad rap. And I mean, I'm just curious, like, why do you think that is?
I just think a lot of people think that kind of what you were saying. A lot of people are like, oh, they ate too much sugar, or you could have prevented this by exercising, or especially if somebody lives in a larger body, they get very much judged for that, especially when they're diagnosed. But I've worked with people of all body types. I've worked with, people that are underweight that have type 2 diabetes, people that of all, you know what I mean? So there's really nothing to discriminate against. And I hope that stigma changes, especially with more education and more people talking about it. I think the approach that we used to take with it, and you'll even see this in the clinical setting as well in the hospital with some doctors and some dietitians too, is, cut this out, cut that out, stop eating this, stop eating that. I have, a lot of people that will message me on Instagram, and one thing I'm passionate about is still eating your cultural foods, no matter what culture you're from, even if, even if it's just something you enjoyed eating as a kid in the area that you're from, you have something that means a lot to you. And a lot of people will say that, my doctor told me I can't eat this anymore, or stop eating the rice, or no more tortillas. And like, ouch, that hurts. That's kind of not nice. But it's just kind of, I think, a lazy way of trying to help people. I think the intent is there, but it's not really helpful. And people have to learn how to eat those types of foods that are a staple in their lifestyle.
Especially because that's such a huge change. If a doctor randomly is like, sorry, you just have to cut out all these foods. It's like, how do you,
Yeah.
it's so hard for somebody to do just out of nowhere. And so, yeah, that's great that you're helping people just learn about food options and how you can keep your cultural food, especially because I'm like Italian. And so I'm like, I can imagine having to like, give up pasta and pizza. Like, that'd be so challenging.
And I'm like, I love pasta and pizza. It's just so good. And I just think our cultural foods are just what makes like it's a way to bond to people. It's such a special part of being human. Like, let's not take that away.
Yes, absolutely. And it's funny you said that too about the weight because I actually interviewed on this podcast Chipmunk Foods. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's like a snack
No.
brand, a cookie brand. But the founder, started that brand because he was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes and he is extremely skinny. So you're
Yeah.
like, how did that even happen? Like, and he didn't even really know either. He's like, I don't know. I just was diagnosed with it, but I started this healthier brand for it. But it is crazy. It's like he had no clue when he was diagnosed, and he just all of a sudden had to like make better choices.
Right. And I think It just really goes to show, like, in the research, we do see that, a 10% reduction in weight can help for some people, but some people don't have weight to lose, right? Like some people, like I said, I've had clients that are underweight and need to gain weight. So that's not the only factor there. And it also goes to show that there are those specific things and specific factors that we have to target with diet and with nutrition. Doesn't mean you have to cut out all of your favorite foods, but for example, reducing saturated fat. In the research, we see that saturated fat increases insulin resistance, which is the root cause of type 2 diabetes. We also see that an increase in plant foods and plant proteins, which are low in saturated fat and high in fiber, a blood sugar stabilizing nutrient, can actually help improve insulin resistance. So those strategic changes are really what it's about, regardless of all of those other things. You see it?
Yes. Oh, yes. Yes.
Fascinating. Yeah, it's a trick.
Unfortunately, we do see it.
Yeah.
So I'm curious too, because of treatment options for type 2. So it's different
Yes.
for everyone, and it's probably just different on how bad your insulin resistance is, I'm assuming. But some type 2 do take insulin, correct?
Yeah, some people with type 2 diabetes do take insulin, and it's tricky because everyone really has a differing degree of insulin resistance. And how I like to explain it to my clients is that we want our pancreatic function to be at 100%. Obviously, we want to have 100% ability to bring our blood glucose into range as best as possible. But unfortunately, some people are at 80% of their ability to use their pancreas, while some people might be at 20%. And we can't really say, based on anything except the numbers at the end of the day. So we can, use those evidence-based interventions, nutrition, lifestyle, stress management, sleep, and touch on all of those different factors. But, like you said, it is going to vary a little bit from person to person and where they're at.
Okay, yeah, because I was always curious about that too. I wasn't sure if type 2s only had lifestyle changes that they could make, or if they were able to like also take insulin. And
Yeah.
my friend's dad actually has type 2, and he just takes one shot in the morning of insulin. So he doesn't take it like for food, which is what I do. So it is
Yeah.
interesting to hear about like the different ways that you can treat yourself.
Yeah, it is interesting. Yeah, so it's pretty similar when it comes to insulin. There's basal, there's bolus insulin. So you have, sort of like the background insulin where your pancreas is just constantly, in anyone, releasing little spurts of insulin, as to keep you, in range. And then you also have the insulin that your body releases as a result of seeing your blood glucose elevate. So some people, they are really at that strong level of insulin resistance. Unfortunately, type 2 diabetes is a progressive disease. So with time, it can worsen, which is really why we want to intervene as quickly as possible. In the pre-diabetes stage, where you have an A1C between 5.7 and 6.4%, you really can reverse it. That is the optimal time to do that. That's the warning sign. But once you're in the type 2 phase, not that it's impossible, but it just means that we have a more serious level of progressed insulin resistance, and you have less of those insulin producing cells. So we're working with less.
Okay, so if you are technically diagnosed as a type 2, your chance of it going away is probably very slim.
You have a lot less of a chance of it to completely go away. And I will say this is actually a really interesting conversation, because it's kind of controversial right now in the healthcare field, because we don't really know if that's possible per se. And if it is possible, we have to have set criteria and guidelines on what that means, right? So currently, what they're saying is that you need to be in a certain A1C range and have a certain glucose level for over 3 months without any interventions. So completely on your own, no insulin, no medication, and be able to sustain that. So they're still kind of deciding on whether or not this is possible. Some people do it, even for example, people that get bariatric surgery or weight loss surgery, some people will see type 2 diabetes go away, and it's just not a thing after that, which I don't know, I just think that's really fascinating information. But some people with type 2 diabetes do go into remission, and that's the term that we're using, is remission. So I'm just interested to see where the research takes us in the next decade or so. But I do see people that are able to at least achieve the non-diabetes A1C, which is really wonderful.
But are they still able to eat like foods that they would want to eat, or are they like still dieting or, like eating low carb to achieve
Yeah.
the number?
Well, one thing that I really focus on with my clients is making sure that we're not going super low carb because that's just not sustainable for the long run. And like, I'm never gonna, I will actually, I think people probably think like it's kind of weird for a dietitian to be like, no, don't cut out chocolate, or like, no, don't never eat a cheeseburger again, because you have to enjoy those things once in a while. But they are eating those foods, but they know the proper quantities. They know how frequently they should be eating them. They know how to balance those foods when they do eat them. So that's really the key difference.
Okay.
What you're doing the majority of the time is what really adds up and helps you get there.
I'm just curious, like what types of nutrition tips would you give someone right now if they came to you and they're like, I was just diagnosed with type 2, like what do I do?
Oh my goodness, I love this question. Yeah. So my first tip is always stop skipping meals. I see in a lot of people, and you probably experience and see this with your blood sugars too. Like if you skip a meal, first of all, what's going to happen is that you're going to get so hungry come that next meal that when you're in that state of being just completely ravenous, you're not really thinking about what should I choose? Does this have, all of the components of a balanced meal? And you might overeat just a little bit, especially if you're eating fast and you're starving, right? So your blood sugars are going to dip low, 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 and you might be hypoglycemic, and then they burst up really high, really fast. And that's kind of what we want to avoid. So having 3 regular meals per day, it might sound old school and not sexy or fun or anything like that, but honestly, just those 3 regular meals per day, approximately the same amount of grams of carbs at each meal, is really one thing that can help with your blood sugars a lot just to start. And then also I tell my clients, emphasize protein and make half your plate non-starchy vegetables. Protein and fiber are 2 blood sugar stabilizing nutrients, and not only that, but they're really satiating. So I say the example of oatmeal. If you've ever had a bowl of oatmeal, and typically it's just a bowl of carbs, right? So it's like oats, you might put a little milk in there or water, and then maybe some fruit on the top, and it's just carbs on carbs on carbs, which is delicious but not always the best for blood sugars. So if you put a little, maybe you like mix in half a scoop of protein powder, maybe you put some chia seeds or whatever kind of seeds you like, and some nut butter, now we have some protein and some healthy fats, and that's going to make it last a lot longer. So instead of being hungry in like an hour, that'll last maybe 4 or 5 hours, which is the goal.
That's funny you bring up oatmeal, because if I eat just oatmeal, my blood sugar will spike for sure. It is one of those challenging foods, but you're right. If you add some protein in it, I mean, protein is magical when it comes to blood sugar. It
Amazing.
really is.
I
So,
love it. Yeah, and it's so cool that you see that real-time data, especially with type 1. It's getting more popular with type 2, but the CGMs and the continuous glucose monitors, you get to see that real-time data, which I think is really awesome to see how your body's responding.
yeah, and I actually have a question about CGMs because you brought that up. Because not as many type 2s use them, but is that because of insurance reasons?
Yes, mostly. So when it comes to CGMs, I mean, I think at this point they're getting more popular, so they are, more people are able to get them. But one, you typically need a prescription from your doctor, and then you also need insurance to cover it. So that's really the issue for some people; they just aren't able to get them.
I
I
mean,
wish they could, because they're
I mean,
great.
they're so expensive. So I can understand why somebody would not want one if they had to pay for it
Yeah.
out of pocket, because it is so expensive. But you're right, it is so helpful, and it is really cool to see. Even like I personally have learned just like what's healthy food for me based on what's happening to my blood sugar. And I'm like, wow, like who knew that bag of chips was not healthy? Like you don't know that until you see it affect your blood sugar.
Right. And it's really interesting because you might look at the ingredients and it might be like ingredients that you think are so healthy. Like it might be like a bean chips or something, and there might be some sort of seeds or something in there. But what I also find to be kind of an interesting topic that I talk about a lot with clients and followers is what's healthy isn't always the best for blood sugar management. Healthy and weight loss is like its own thing. And then blood sugar management and those specific factors to consider are a different thing. Sometimes there's a convergence. But yeah, I just think it's really interesting.
Well, and it's hard nowadays with all the like packaged food out there that are claiming things are healthy, because you want to trust that. You're like, oh, look, it says it's
Yeah.
healthy. It says it has all this whatever in it.
Mhm.
And then you realize, okay, no, it's literally just marketing something to me. It's not actually healthy.
100%. It's so common, and I wish there were more regulations on that. But manufacturers and brands, they are so creative, and they know how to get away with using those terms. Obviously, certain things are, protected and whatnot, but there's certain terms that you can just use however you want. So I always tell people the nutrition label is the gold standard. So if you really know how to read the nutrition label, that is so empowering for your blood sugars and for your overall health.
Yeah, and even so, I was only diagnosed with type 1 a little over 3 years ago. And before
Wow.
I was diagnosed, I don't think I ever looked at a nutrition label. Because why would you, right?
See,
Like you have no
yeah,
reason to look at one. And then now they start looking at them, I'm like disgusted by some of the
yeah,
things that are in in packaged food. I'm like, oh, this is so gross. So I'm like,
yes.
sometimes diabetes can be a benefit because you start to actually realize like what's healthy.
I love what you just said. I love because it's almost like that reframing too is so important. And that's something that I like to talk about with clients too, because diabetes burnout is real, type 1, type 2, whatever kind it is. And I think, it's just really hard to be able to reframe it and see like, okay, maybe this is happening for a reason. I hate that horrible things happen like this. A diagnosis is never a good thing, but if there has to be at least something that you take from it, it's the healing. There's almost like a healing journey that goes on. And with any kind of a diagnosis, there's like that immediate like grieving period for a while, like of like the life that you wish that you had, and the ease and the lack of stress that there once was. And now you're like faced with the reality of what's there. But when you start learning all of those things, there's a healing that goes on that's just beyond your day to day. That's why I personally got into nutrition myself, but I love seeing people reframe it like that. Like, I think that's so beautiful.
Yeah, and food is hard because you eat it multiple times per day. So you're reminded constantly of your disease multiple times per day. And it is a
Yeah.
very hard diagnosis. I mean,
Yeah.
anything I guess related to food, any type of diagnosis is hard just because it's like it's you can't hide from it. It's there all the time. And so it's very, very challenging. And I'm
Right.
curious, are there any fad diets right now, like, all over social media that you just don't agree with?
Love this question as well. So I will just preface it by saying that in general, I try to get people away from diets overall, just because you start it and then it's going to end at some point. There's always an end date when it comes to a diet. I'm like, where do I start? Oh my goodness. So I will start with two. So carnivore and keto are not my favorite. And I have some posts on this and I can go into more detail, but both of the carnivore and keto diet. So anytime you demonize a nutrient, there's going to be an increase in other nutrients, right? So if you ever went on like MyFitnessPal or anything where you logged your food, you have that pie chart. And so if you cut out carbs, now your entire caloric intake is coming from fat and protein. And unfortunately, when you increase, protein and fat so much, typically you have to be someone that eats animal proteins, right? In order to get enough calories and nutrition. But animal protein is high in saturated fat. It doesn't mean that you have to cut it out entirely, but just keeping in mind that it's going to be high in saturated fat and you're going to be taking in a lot of this nutrient that is really worsening the root issue of insulin resistance. And so I see with a lot of people that have been on these like very low carb diets or carnivore or keto for a long time, that they have a really, really high degree of insulin resistance and a very low tolerance to eating carbohydrates. So when they do eat a carbohydrate the next time, it's like, whoa, their blood sugar spike. Even with all of the tools, we really have to kind of like titrate them up to increase their carbohydrate tolerance, basically. So I don't love those ones. It's, also I try to stress that. So just a couple fancy words. There's glycogenolysis, which is something that occurs. Basically, your liver and muscle tissue will store extra glucose in the form of glycogen. And when you don't consume enough carbohydrate, you don't have enough energy, your body's going to break down that stored glycogen and convert it into glucose. And so regardless of eating carbohydrates or not, your body is already a step ahead of you, and it's going to release that stored glucose, which can then elevate your blood sugars. We also have gluconeogenesis, which basically means creation of new glucose. And what that means is that even protein and fat in the metabolic cycle, to keep it simple, can both turn into glucose. So they can both be converted into glucose, not just carbohydrate, which I think a lot of people don't know that. It's pretty, again, fascinating. So if those can turn into glucose, it's very clear that when we try to understand the process of our body, that our body wants glucose. And whether or not we consume it, it's going to find a way to create glucose in any condition that it can. And so we might as well just eat the carbohydrates in the right way, learn how to do it for the long run. And again, eating the carbohydrates is incorporating those plant foods, which help insulin resistance, and they're delicious. So why not,
Is there like an amount of carbs per day that you like recommend, or like, because I mean, it could be anything, it could be like 10 carbs to 500
Yeah.
carbs. Like, how many would you like recommend?
It's really going to depend on the person. So, different things like gender, height, age, activity level, all of those things, maybe even I have clients that are breastfeeding, for example, or pregnant, for example, those increase nutrient requirements. And so it's
Mhm.
going to be different from person to person, but typically a good moderate carbohydrate intake level is anywhere from 45% to 65% of total caloric intake. So for example, when you use the classic like 2000 calorie per day diet, say you do 50%, that's about 250 grams of carbohydrates per day. And that's usually the response that I get from people is like, whoa, whoa, I don't know if I can do that, So it actually is a lot more than people think. And I would even say that most people that I work with are probably already not eating that many grams of carbs. And so again, there's so many things that can go into it, but yeah, it's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, wow, I was shocked by that number actually.
Yeah,
I mean,
right?
it's one of those things that's it's easy to hit, like if you're eating pizza, like that's an easy number to
Yeah,
hit. But if you're not, then it's like, oh, that is kind of challenging, but interesting.
yeah,
I'm gonna have to
definitely.
relook at my carb counts.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And I think also like when people are, consuming like sugar sweetened beverages and, beverages are a way that people will get more in, I have to say. But, and this is just kind of a little bit off topic, but I have a lot of clients that are like, can you help me work on my fitness too? I want to put on more lean muscle mass and whatnot. And so just kind of a fun fact, but I almost became a sports dietitian because I just really think it's so fascinating. And my senior project was a literature review on how carbohydrate intake enhances protein uptake in performance athletes. And so anyone who's trying to basically build muscle, you do need to incorporate carbohydrate with protein. And so in my younger years in college, even as myself now being a dietitian back then, I even had a little bit of a fear of carbohydrates. And so I did a little kind of like test on myself. I was not eating enough back then. And I did my own, calculations and macros, and I went hard in the gym. And I'm telling you, I have never put on muscle so fast in my life when I was eating the amount of carbohydrates and total calories that I should have been eating. It is fascinating. I was fascinated just practicing that on myself. So I always tell people if that's a goal of yours and you really want to build lean muscle tissue, you have to eat the carbs and the calories.
Right, and you were gaining muscle, not fat.
Yeah, it was lean muscle tissue. And even so, when you're putting on even lean muscle mass, you're going to gain a little bit of fat because you have to be in a caloric surplus. But yeah, it was a lot of lean muscle tissue because my body was using all of those nutrients to build that tissue. So I just found that really fascinating because we know that to be true in the science, but yet even healthcare providers still have these fears sometimes.
Well, it is scary because if you're like, oh, I'm trying to tone up, you think the opposite.
Yeah.
You think I have to eat less because that's what we've been trained to learn
Yeah.
over time. So it's like hard to be like, oh wait, I have to eat more. Like it's a scary concept.
Yeah, it's kind of counterintuitive, and my clients struggle with that all the time. And I remind them, like, the analogy that I give is, say you want to build a Lego castle and you have like three types of pieces that you need, right? Let's pretend those are proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. If you don't have enough of each one and you don't have the right amount, you can't build the castle. The castle isn't going to be finished at the end. It's just not. So you have to eat the right way to build, that total result that you want.
My husband does Ironmans, and I can't tell
Wow.
you how many carbs he eats. Like it's
I'm
unreal.
sure.
And but he's so toned, and I'm like, wait, this is
Yeah.
not fair.
Yeah, I
But
know.
but it is true. Like he has to do that to be able to even do his Ironmans, and then it all, it's just a cycle. But
Yeah.
it's cool to see it actually happen in like a real life person.
Yeah, that's so awesome. Yeah, and he's using it right away. So that's so fascinating.
Yeah. What tips would you give someone right now that is newly diagnosed with type 2 diabetes?
Yeah, so what tips would I give somebody that was just diagnosed? So definitely, again, yeah, don't skip your meals. Make sure that you really have an understanding of portioning your carbohydrates. That's not a fun thing to talk about, but it is something that really has an impact on your blood sugar numbers. But by incorporating enough protein and fiber, in filling up on those things, you're going to inadvertently portion the carbohydrates anyways, right? So just making sure that you have an understanding of what should your plate look like, what should your meals and snacks look like, and that's going to be really, really helpful over time. And also, my other thing is just don't be afraid to reach out for help. There's so many tools out there, so many providers out there that are ready to help you. And I think, I've talked to a lot of people that have said, I worked with a dietitian before and I just didn't get what I needed. It just wasn't the right fit. They gave me a list. They told me eat this and not that. But I think that unfortunately, the healthcare system, it's not really conducive sometimes to helping people. And so it's almost like finding the right hairstylist or the right therapist or something. It takes a couple times to find that person that's the right match for you, and what you specifically want to learn how to do. But yeah, I think you just have to find that right match. And with the healthcare system, most insurance will cover 3 visits with a dietitian per year. And I used to be that dietitian, and it was fascinating seeing, for some people it worked. They're like, I just need the information and I'm good. But for other people, the 1 hour and having like 12 handouts is like, whoa, this is overwhelming. I am already overwhelmed and feeling so many emotions with this diagnosis. And now I have to go through all these stacks of paper. I don't get it. I'm not even here right now. So wait until you feel ready to make those changes. And then, talk to a couple different people out there, find the right provider for you. It might have to be outside of the Western healthcare system. Unfortunately, not even just with dietitians, but nurses and, all sorts of therapists and things like that are going outside of the healthcare system to provide a higher level of care, where they can work with you for a longer period of time to actually get to know what your goals are, specifically who you are, what your lifestyle is, what does a day look like for you, what do you like eating, what do you not like eating, and that really, I think, makes the difference in people.
Because you're mentioning that, like, are your services like? How do you help
Yes.
people?
Yeah, so what I do now is I have a 4-month coaching program, and there's different levels that I have depending on the level of accountability and support that you need, and also your price point, obviously. And so what I do is I have weekly group coaching calls. We meet every single week, and I have education and then work with clients one-on-one there. It's just a really wonderful, supportive environment. And then I have curriculum for them, tools that make it easier for them, recipes, and then I also have daily chat. So most of them I speak with pretty much every day, which I think is some of their favorite parts of the program. And then I also have one-to-one. Some people just need that higher level of support. So I have various options, but yeah.
I love group programs too, because you're
Yeah.
mentioning that, because it's so nice. You learn from the other people going through it as well, and it's nice that you don't feel as alone either when there's other people involved.
Yeah, and that's the other part I didn't mention. There's a community for everyone to kind of connect to. And I think you're so right, because people kind of underestimate the importance of that, but it can be really isolating. Even if you do know some people that have the diagnosis, like sometimes you might just not be ready to talk about it. Or I've had clients that are like, I have only told my husband, I haven't told my kids, I haven't told anyone. And I'm like, that is so valid, like you just need a safe space to like sit with it for a second and like to have other people that understand what that's like. And again, I always bring it back to like the healing aspect. I just think that that can be really healing for people to feel connected and seen in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. So how do people find you? How do they get in touch?
Yeah, so if anyone wants to find me, you can always reach out. I love, connecting with people on Instagram. It's Kristina Cooke, Kristina with a K, Cook with an E. And you can find me at type2.diabetes.nutritionist, 2 dots. You can also check out my website if you want, which is KristinaCookeNutrition.com. So again, KristinaCooke, nutrition.com.
I'll include that all below too, just in case. Well, thank you so much for being here. This was great.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was so fun.
Of course.